Good morning, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the latest in our series of webinars hosted here at Holborn. And today's subject, we're talking about specifically expatriates and your taxes, and the latest update, 4 years on from a very significant tax change that happened in South Africa. We shouldn't always be focusing on taxes, and ideally we don't here at Holborn. We look at a whole range of subjects that we often discuss, but quite often what we find is that it's taxation that brings clients to want to have the conversation in the first place. So it's very important that we are aware of something that is inevitable. As they often say, the only two things in life that are certain are death and taxes, and I'd rather have a chat about taxes than talking about death if the choice is there. Today I'm joined by a couple of very important qualified individuals that will talk through what we have to think about in this regard. So first of all, Mark McAllister from Global Capital Resources will be talking about how a number of individuals work across the piece on agency arrangements. So if you're working abroad, and we quite often have rotational workers, and I'll talk about that specific requirement, looking to bill their services to global companies. Mark and his team work and assist there. And then secondly, Rex Cowley from Overseas Trust and Pension. So I'll introduce them fully in their respective sections, but first and foremost, Mark, Rex, good afternoon. Thank you both very much for joining. I hope you're both well. We'll then move on and have a Q&A session at the end, and that's your opportunity to our listeners to ask any questions. So if you are interested, please do fill in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen now. You'll see a little button there on Zoom. Ask the questions as we go along, as they come to you, and we'll try and collate those and answer those questions at the end, but also in an interactive format. So thanks once again for everybody taking the time to join us. So who is this webinar for? Well, there's a number of groups that might find this discussion interesting. So are you currently abroad and thinking about coming back to South Africa at some point soon? Are you already maybe here but work outside of the borders of South Africa? You might spend more than 183 days, of which 60 might be consecutively outside of the country. You might work in, for example, the oil and gas or yachting sector, shipping, maritime options, geologists as well. A huge range of career choices, but outside of South Africa. In those sort of overseas arrangements, do you do an element of subcontracting or self-employment? And do you want to potentially protect your foreign earnings and legally mitigate your taxation? And that's something where we can talk about that in a second. And what's the relevant legislation that you should be thinking about? There's a number of things to think about, and we'll come on to that in a bit. So linking all of that together, what are the questions that we often hear? Well, one of the things to understand is the significant change that happened 4 years ago. And the reason for this webinar, looking back 4 years ago, was this change Tax Act in South Africa. So once you become a South African tax resident, this could apply to you, and it's section 1010.2 of the Income Tax Act, which says that South African residents working abroad will only be exempt from paying tax on the first 1.25 million rand that they earn abroad. After this, they will then be taxed at the personal marginal rate. So that's what changed. There was a lot of press around this, a lot of fear and a lot of uncertainty from some quarters. But one thing that I think is relevant to point out now, we've got a bit of experience and we're 4 years down the line, is this very important stat. So in January 2020, you could have earned $89,000, as a rotational worker, as an example, before you would be in the tax net as a South African working abroad in that manner. As of today, 67,500. So one of the challenges with how the legislation has been written is that as the rand continues and has depreciated over a number of years, the amount that you are able to earn effectively outside of South Africa before this 1.25 million threshold is utilized is reducing, and has reduced quite significantly over a period of time. So this then rolls on to the next question. So how do you protect your earnings when you're earning dollars, pounds, or euros and you're outside of South Africa? And that's where I'm going to bring Mark in shortly to talk a little bit more about that. How do others, mitigate the tax that they pay legally? And then how do you plan for your future? And that's where I want to bring in Rex to talk through that and some of the tools that are available to achieve that. So if these questions are resonating with you, if they kind of make a little bit of sense, then that's what we're here to talk about today. Anything outside of that, we'll do our best to answer as well, but just ask those questions at the bottom in the Q&A. So a little bit about us before we get started. Holborn's been around for 25 years now, and so we formed in 1998. And today we're the second largest independently family-owned financial advisor in the world. Our assets under management just under the $3 billion mark. We've got 23 offices managing over 20,000 internationally minded, a lot of them expat clients globally. What are the 5 main reasons why people choose to do business with us as a company? Well, firstly is our size. As I mentioned, that size is quite significant in our industry. So it gives us the ability to negotiate the best in class in solutions for our clients and pass those savings on to our clients. We're also completely independent. So this pillar is a really important one. You won't find us providing a solution with just a Holborn badge on it. Actually, the vast majority of what we do doesn't have a Holborn badge on it. We go to the whole of market and find, what is the best solution for you as the client with complete independence and impartiality. Consistently, we are a front runner for service awards in our industry. For example, the International Investment Awards, kind of like our industry Oscars, we've won numerous times over the last few years. And we'll get a feeling of like a little bit of an old school private bank kind of solution. So very, very hands-on. It's not robo advice. We meet with our clients quarterly, no matter where they are around the world. From an education point of view, our advisors are all educated to a very high standard, both locally, for example, where I am here in South Africa, but also internationally, normally through the Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment. So you know that you have the best in class from an advisory perspective on a global scale, not just on a localized, say, South African approach. And finally, when it comes to making investments, safety and security is something we hold very, very dear. So we will only recommend solutions that offer some element of guarantee on the capital. So quite often we look to structure solutions in places like the Channel Islands that offer top tier global and government-backed investor protection. Obviously, all on a case-by-case basis, but the bottom line is we want you to be able to sleep soundly at night using those kind of very safe and secure solutions. And that's the 5 reasons why people choose to work with my team and the company Holborn in particular as well. If you want to learn a little bit more about us, please feel free to pop to our website or drop us a message and we'll happily have another discussion with you at some point about our offering. Range of solutions these days. We don't just look after things like pensions and trust, but also we help assist with offshore trust companies, offshore companies, platforms, offshore investment property. We can also help with mortgage and lending, just over my shoulder there, citizenship by investment, so the mobility of individuals and their ability to move freely around the world, and also other alternative investment class. So a very wide depth of solutions now, maybe wider than you maybe realized, depending on when you last interacted with us. But again, keen to sit with you and talk through some of those at a later date if you're interested. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our first speaker. So Mark McAllister is joining us from Global Capital Resources in Mauritius. He's the COO, and his role is to coordinate the team of experts that help expats to manage their income and create solutions that are bespoke for those that work globally in this kind of rotational working environment, particularly. So Mark, I'm not going to steal too much of your thunder. Lovely to have you on board here today. Thank you for taking the time. Do you want to maybe just give us a bit of an overview as to what it is that you do and where your company fits in, and we'll go from there.
Thanks very much, Mark. Oh, you did such a great intro. There's not much I can say. Basically, the company was formed on the back of what we saw was the change of Section 1010. And in that, we saw an opportunity because obviously prior to 2020, there was no limitation on what an expat could earn. So we saw there was going to be a dire need, and obviously with the state of the country and people seeking work elsewhere, we knew that there was going to be an ever-growing kind of market for us to potentially step in and assist people with this with their working offshore. And what's really interesting from your slides is to see the difference between what 1.25 million makes now, with most of our clients earning dollars and pounds. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. So essentially what we do is we're an intermediary. So we try and assist a client where they might be a contractual worker working on, as you indicated in your slides, possibly mostly oil and gas, and now in the renewable energy space, a lot of people that are working on offshore wind and these type of contracts that are, you know, year, 2 years, 3 years sometimes. We negotiate with the client and with the employer as an intermediary, and we sit on the island and we discuss the contracts that the client is going to uptake with the the million, and obviously depending on this in country, but keeping most of the capital or whatever's left of the capital offshore and on the island. From there, sorry, Mark.
Sorry, Mark, I think we're just losing you a little bit there. The connection wasn't.
Is it poor?
Right. Yeah.
Let me switch my camera off.
No problem. No problem. Thank you, Mark. And yeah, that might help if
Let
you.
me switch my camera up and yes. All right. Can you just tell me where you picked me up from, Mark, and then I'll.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to do actually, just we've used this graphic before as a way of visually to try and show how an agency arrangement can work and does often work for individuals, you know, that are working abroad. And I think this really shows it quite nicely, you know, how, you know, the agency can work. So effectively, you know, if it's you guys, it might be others. There's a number of providers in this space. You raise invoices to a client, right? And that client might be in the UK, it might be in America, it might be wherever, depending on the sector. And that we can see there is that yellow line there. And then the fees for those invoices then come back to you guys at the agency. Is that right, Mark? That's how normally these things set up.
That's correct. That's exactly how it's set up. Yes. So it's us engaging with the employer on behalf of the client, and us invoicing the employer on behalf of the client. And obviously the ultimate objective is to then keep the client within the 1.25 that they find tax-free on shore, and then the balance staying on the island and involving people like you later down the line to assist with the other pillars of, well, the other parts of what you can see on the diagram, which is either to invest in pensions or offshore property, et cetera, but we don't personally get involved in that at all. We rely on the experts to do that for us.
Absolutely. I think this is the main thing, is that then, you know, if you want to, you can, you know, have a discussion with the agency around how that's going to work, you know, how your contracting arrangements will be. And part of it is then to look at, you know, do you wish to sacrifice away a proportion in a true solid salary sacrifice arrangement, you know, where you give away a proportion of the income to fund your future retirement and what have you. And that's where I'm going to bring Rex and the team from OTAP in a little bit to talk through how that can work. But the key thing really here, Mark, and this is the bit, you know, if we look about roles and responsibilities, you know, whether funds go down the purple line, which would be fully taxable, you know, depending on whether you're in or out of the country on that exemption that we just talked about, you know, or how much potentially starts to go across down those green lines to fund your future self. Your role in these kind of situations, or as an agency, is to act as that intermediary to raise invoices on behalf of clients that want to have global international solutions. And that's something you guys are very experienced in. Is that a fair sort of summary for the guys and girls that are listening today?
100%. Summed it up perfectly.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm just conscious a little bit about the quality of the connection there, so we're going to move on for that. Mark, thank you very much for giving us a very quick overview on that. And again, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to ask questions, please do in the Q&A bit at the bottom of the screen. We're going to move on now past the sort of mechanisms of how you can look at sort of structuring employment and billing and all those kind of things. And it's a very, very quick overview that we've just shown. And agency route is just one of many different ways that clients can look to structure their affairs. Let's move past that now onto, okay, you're now earning a proportion, you know, overseas in dollars, pounds, or euros, which is great. You're benefiting from the depreciating rand that we talked about earlier, so it's actually going in your favor. You know, maybe there's, you know, you're doing it in a tax efficient format around what's just been discussed, but the bottom line is there is a decision to be made about what all of this money is going to be used for. Okay. And there's a great analogy that applies here, and that's what I've got on the screen in front of me, which is that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. Okay, so you know, whether your decision to start to save for some form of a retirement solution, some form of a financial freedom solution starts, you know, today, or whether you started in 2004, you know, that's specific to you as the individual. The key message from me really is, as a financial planner, is that you need to understand where you are on your financial journey. And if you aren't budgeting, if you aren't allocating a proportion of what you earn towards your future self, you do run the risk of running out of, you know, money later on in life, and your future self will thank you for making this decision. And that's where I, as the financial planner, really come in, is to challenge thinking on that and start to put some numbers around it all. But again, that's something that's best discussed, you know, face to face as part of a proper financial plan. And part of what I'd like to do now is move on to introducing one of our specialists in this area. So from Overseas Trust and Pension, co-founder Rex Cowley. Rex joins us with a wealth of knowledge on how things like overseas pensions and overseas trusts can work when paired into the solutions that we talked about earlier, or on their own. There's other sort of standalone solutions as well. But the key thing is that somebody like Rex can only really assist when somebody that's listening has made the decision that they want to provide for themselves in the future financially, and that's probably going to be some kind of dollars, pounds, euros kind of savings and investment vehicle. So Rex, thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. Hope you're well, and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hi there, Mark. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Given some of the issues we had with the bandwidth, I am going to switch my camera off, but just to say hello to all of those that are here. And then let me share my screen. Mark, if you can just confirm if my screen is coming through, that'd be kind. Right, should be sharing.
Going through now, perfect.
Perfect, thanks very much. So there we go, that's me. Right, so I think I just wanted to pick up on a few things that the two Marks really were talking about. I think the first one is Mark's analogy about planting a tree. And I think, you know, what it's all about, why are we talking today? You know, what's it actually about? Well, it's about an outcome, a future outcome that's really, really important. And that's simply being that when you get to the point that you want to stop working, you have enough money to support yourself and your family from there onwards. Yeah, so retirement, we often think it's quite far away, and we don't necessarily make provision in the way we should. And before we know it, it's there, and we haven't provided enough. I think spending time on developing and accumulating your wealth for retirement is really important. And in fact, the comment that Warren Buffett had when he spoke about pensions at one of the conferences that he regularly runs was that the first thing you do is provide for your retirement. Whatever you've got left, that's what you live on. And I doubt there's very many of us that actually live in that way. I think the second thing to pick up on is that retirement and employment go hand in hand. Yeah. but it doesn't necessarily always work that way, particularly for expats with regards to making provision for retirement. So it should really go hand in hand. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about now is some of the options that you might have, and then some of the advantages of utilizing international retirement plans as part of your wealth creation, that building of wealth for yourself, so that you can actually live that life that you actually want to do. In other words, you get the most out of your employment. There was one other little anecdotal thing. I was sitting in a conference a little while ago, a pension conference, and we were talking about a lot of things. And the speaker said, who in the room is 50? And they said, well, a bunch of people. They said, well, who wants to retire at 55? Who wants to retire at 60? And there were hands going up in the room. And the sobering point for those of us that want to retire at 55, we only had 60 paydays left for that were 50. And for those who want to retire at 60, they had 120 paydays left to finish their provision in terms of retirement. So it does go past very quickly. So the thing is, if you haven't planted a tree 20 years ago, plant it now. So I think the first thing, as an expat, you're working abroad. Your departure point in terms of thinking really revolves around your tax residency. So that's the first thing that I think you need to really understand. Are you tax resident in South Africa, or are you tax resident somewhere else? And what does that actually mean? So there's often confusion over the concept of tax residency. It has nothing to do with your citizenship. People obviously think I'm a South African, therefore I'm a South African tax resident. Citizenship is all about home affairs. Tax residency is obviously all about SARS. So there's two forms. There's two ways you become tax resident in South Africa. One is the physical presence test. In other words, you spend more than 91 days in any 6 tax years in South Africa. You're a resident by way of permanency. The other one is that you were born in South Africa. You are abroad, but your ultimate intention is to return to South Africa. So it doesn't matter how many years you stay away, 20, 30, 40 years, if your intention is to come back to South Africa, you're ordinarily tax resident. Whether you're a tax resident through permanent residency or ordinarily residency, that means you need to file a tax return each year, and you're subject to the tax laws of South Africa. And hence that foreign earned income allowance that Mark was speaking about is a really critical element, because that provides you with your first piece of tax relief. Okay, so we all want to obviously only pay the right amount of tax. And therefore, it becomes quite important to start to look at vehicles that you can use to, I suppose, normalize a tax position. And I think for a lot of expatriates, they don't use retirement plans, which actually can help them normalize that tax position. So they might be paying a very high tax burden because they don't have terribly many tax efficient structures around them. So we're going to have a look at some of those structures. But the next point is, okay, where am I tax resident? And we'll look at those briefly in terms of I'm not actually tax resident in South Africa. I might be a South African. There's a chance I come back to South Africa, but at the moment, that's not what I'm thinking. So I'm not really ordinarily resident. And then, of course, those of you that are either working abroad on short, long-term contracts, maybe on a more permanent basis, but do come back or intend to come back. So the next departure point is, okay, so we've got where am I tax resident? The next point is, how am I employed? And then that is going to have a bearing on how you contribute or how provision is made into a retirement scheme for you. So you're either self-employed, you might have contracts that you have directly with companies, you might be a freelancer operating on that basis, you might be working on an agency arrangement, as Mark was talking about. Very, very common, or you might be employed by the actual company itself that is providing you with work. So you're going to be employed on one of those 3 bases. Now, that's quite an important thing. And why that is important is that if you look at tax legislation around the world, there's a concept which is tax exempt or exempt tax. Now, I know that's a bit of jargon, but what it means is that when it comes to pensions, generally speaking, tax authorities will say that if you put money into the pension and you are taxed on that money you put in, you won't be taxed on the growth and you won't be taxed on what you got out. Okay. However, if you got an exemption on the money you put in or tax relief on the money you put in, you won't be taxed on what's in there and the growth, but you will be taxed when it comes out. So you either pay tax on the front or you pay tax on the back, and you have levels of exemption. So this is a really important concept. And it's an important concept because if you are abroad and you're working abroad, you're rendering services abroad, not in South Africa, when you return to South Africa, they actually exempt you in respect of your foreign pension. So if your foreign pension pays you in South Africa, you are exempt from a tax on that foreign pension. So for those of you that are working abroad, and you can get your employer to contribute to an international retirement plan, the advantage of that is it will be tax exempt when you draw it in South Africa. So I think there you can start to see the benefits of getting your employer to make contributions. Now, your employer can either contribute to a personal scheme, so you can set up your own personal pension plan. It's your own pot, but your employer contributes to it. Your employer might have a pension scheme already, or might set up a pension scheme for you and make contributions into that scheme. Okay, so under those circumstances, we have that employer-employee relationship, and they're contributing to the scheme. You return to South Africa at some point in the future. When you draw, you've got a tax exemption on that money. Also, all the funds within that pension scheme have grown without tax on them. So you have a tax-free roll-up environment within that pension scheme and then tax exemption. What you don't have is tax relief. So you've still got your 1.25 million rand in terms of foreign earnings allowance, but the contribution portion will still form part of your overall taxable income. So as I said, you've paid your income tax, but now you've got a tax-free roll-up and your tax exemption. So I hope that makes that sort of clear in terms of that. If you can't get your employer to contribute, or maybe you're self-employed, then that option of having the employer-employee relationship in terms of the contribution obviously isn't on the table. But it doesn't prevent you from still utilizing an international retirement plan to accumulate and build wealth. As Mark said, this isn't all about tax, but the more tax efficiency you can get in, the better your overall long-term return is going to be. But if you are using up just your own personal pension scheme and you are contributing to that scheme, what you do still do is you still create that roll-up environment from a tax perspective. And let's say your overall contributions whilst working abroad, you've been contributing that money, you've put in $1 million. When you come back to South Africa, you're effectively able to take that $1 million out over a period of time without any tax, and all the gains and income that will have accrued in your pension scheme will be tax deferred until they are eventually drawn. So you don't get the tax exemption, but all your capital that's in there is no further tax to pay on it, and you've actually had your tax-free roll-up in your foreign pension scheme, and you only pay tax when that's eventually drawn down. And of course, if you're now into retirement, you probably have, as you get older, we sort of get better tax benefits, don't we? We sort of get better exemptions and that as we get older. So you can sort of plan and manage your tax position into retirement. So what I'm saying is there, your employer-employee relationship, whether it's funding an occupational scheme or your own personal scheme, that's a home run. It's a brilliant position to be in. Otherwise, still setting up provision for yourself for a personal scheme, also a great place to be. You just don't get that exemption on everything when it comes out when you're in South Africa. So I think those are sort of the options there. I think the other thing that's worthwhile noting on your foreign pensions, if you return to South Africa and you've built up quite a decent nest egg into a foreign pension scheme, and you're now employed back in South Africa, and you want to continue to make contributions to your foreign pension, you can. There's a lot of confusion around that. Some people say you can't, some people say you can, some people say it's right, some people say it's wrong. But that confusion was all nicely cleared up by South African Revenue Services, who issued a General Binding Ruling 25, which specifically deals with contributions made to a foreign pension whilst you're a resident in South Africa, and those earnings are from South African source. So they say, yes, absolutely, you can continue to contribute. And what they've actually done there, it's a great bit of work by SARS. They've also issued a practice note 104. It's quite a lengthy document. But what they say is, You spent 20 years working abroad, you've come back and you've made additional contributions into this pension scheme. Some of it was your employer, some of it was you. How on earth are we going to tax you? And they've got the attribution ratios that they put in there to ensure that on the portion that was contributed by your employer whilst you were overseas, that element is tax exempt. The bit that you contributed whilst you're back in South Africa, that element is subject to tax. So the tax environment in South Africa, or the framework, is very well constructed specifically to deal with matters of taxation. Whether you should put money into the same scheme or have a separate personal scheme, there's a question about that. And of course, that's why you would speak to people at Holborn to effectively advise you as whether it makes sense or not to mix foreign earnings with local earnings in an offshore structure. There's a bit of complexity there. And as I said, you need to speak to someone like Holborn. I think if you, the other thing to pick up on is often asked questions is salary sacrifice arrangements. Now, a salary sacrifice arrangement is where you negotiate your contract and instead of earning X, you agree to earn less than that, which is Y, in return for some form of benefit later on, typically a retirement benefit. The whole idea of salary sacrifices, or the benefit of salary sacrifices, is that therefore let's say your earned income goes from $200,000 a year down to $150,000 a year. You're obviously going to save an awful lot of income tax on that because you've got your foreign earned income allowance, or as Mark pointed out, it's about 1.25 million, whatever that might equate to in dollars. But then the difference you're going to pay tax on. So if you can reduce your income, and that income is effectively put into a pension scheme for you, that sounds like a good thing to do. However, salary sacrifices or sacrifice arrangements are very, very complex. Yeah, and whilst we have fantastic legal precedent in South Africa, it's the Anglo case versus SARS, which set out the principles, the practices, and the processes that have to be adopted in full in order to have a bona fide salary sacrifice arrangement. When we look at the number of cases that have gone to court, SARS versus the employer, SARS is in the lead. They have around about 56% of cases that they've won, where they've identified that salary sacrifice schemes haven't been set up appropriately. And therefore, all the cost and effort that's gone into doing it doesn't actually result in anything other than a tax bill for the the employee. So what I'm saying is salary sacrifice is talked about, very complex. It needs to be set up specifically in line with the principles set out in that legal case I just spoke about, the Anglo versus SARS case. But if done properly, there is merit in it. But I think for the majority of South Africans working abroad, you will also find that theoretically it might sound like a good idea, but in practice, your company will probably shy away from such a scheme because of the cost and complexity of actually implementing it. So it's a nice idea if you're lucky enough to be with a company that operates on salary sacrifice basis and it's a bona fide structure, then you're going to be obviously not paying any income tax on ultimately the pension pot that is built up for you, albeit when it pays out, you will pay income tax at that point. So I think those are your sort of options with regard to your international pensions. And I sort of, just as a reminder, I said, why at the start, why do we do this? We save for retirement. It's critical. No one else is going to save for our retirement. It all sits with us these days. The state's not going to do it. In many instances, our companies don't do it. They give us the money, or they'll make provision into a scheme for us. So pension funding, retirement funding very much sits on our own shoulders these days. So when you start to look at international pensions, let's have a look at some of the quick benefits. One, you can retain your earnings in hard currency, which most people want to do. Just send back to South Africa what you might need. And, you might have your family still in South Africa. You might be purchasing assets in South Africa in advance of a move back into the country, whatever the case might be. But you can retain your assets in hard currency. And of course, you can continue to invest in all of those good things that Mark was talking about. And of course, Holborn advise on all those investments. Simplicity. Again, the nice thing about pensions, they are very simple. And that's important because they're understood by tax authorities. And generally, we all understand what a pension is. I put money in, it grows, and I eventually take my money out in some shape or form when I get into retirement. It's not complicated. And by it not being complicated, it doesn't raise flags with tax authorities in terms of anti-avoidance. So you will find multiple company and trust structures which are set up with one thing in mind, and that is to try and avoid tax. Those fall foul of anti-avoidance principles these days. Pensions are designed to be simple, and pensions are expected to be tax efficient. And as I talked about from a South African point of view, under certain circumstances, you get your tax exemptions, which is exactly what it is all about, or your tax-free roll-up. Pensions give you asset protection, often overlooked, depending on what you do. If a catastrophe event happens, whatever that event might be, and you're wiped out financially, when the dust settles, those assets that sit in your pension are 100% protected. No third-party claims by individuals, corporations, or governments can be laid against pension assets, particularly from a Guernsey perspective, where our pensions are based. So asset protection is absolutely a critical core part of that, because at the end of the day, you can't afford to lose the money that you've built up because of some outside event. The other thing with international pensions, they pay benefits in different types, from taking a lump sum to an annuity and something in between. You can draw down and do all kinds of different things with your benefits. So they're very, very flexible. This means that you can actually tailor the pension benefits or the pension that you receive in multiple different ways. And of course, it doesn't have to be paid in South Africa. It can be paid offshore. And of course, portability. For a lot of the customers that we see, they will work in multiple territories over the course of their life with multiple companies. And therefore, they'll have been saving in, whether it's dollars, in yen, Swiss francs, euros, whatever the case might have been, they will have saved from different territories over the course of their life in different currencies, and they may very well choose to retire in a territory other than South Africa. They might need to draw a currency, a benefit in a different currency. So portability is critical, or one of the key advantages of foreign pensions. Of course, succession and probate, one of the most overlooked points when it comes to holding assets in multiple territories. Now, I think, as an expatriate or someone that's working abroad, might still be living in South Africa, but you're working abroad and earning abroad, you end up in this difficult position where you've now got assets in South Africa, you've got bank accounts and assets outside of South Africa sitting in different countries. What happens if you pass away? How do you get those foreign assets into your spouse's name if that's what the intention is? Okay, and of course, passing away with foreign assets in your own names means that you might have a South African will, but that isn't a valid will in the UK or in a European country or in America. And you also probably haven't necessarily considered the tax and administrative burden of transferring those assets into somebody's name. So now you have a South African will that's not valid overseas. Now your family's got a real problem, because now they've got to try and prove that succession should be to the spouse, and there's a process to go through and cost in that. So unless you have a foreign will, succession and probate can be a very difficult thing, i.e. probate being the legal right to transfer the asset from the account holder to your spouse or dependent or whatever it might be. Your foreign pensions mitigate the need for your foreign will. They mitigate all foreign death duties, and they mitigate the concept, or the administrative concept of probate. So very, very seamless, those assets transfer to your spouse or your beneficiaries, however it might be. None of us like to think about the end of our lives, but it's a really important part of financial planning. And of course, the last point, tax. We talked about tax. Retirement plans are tax efficient. The studies have shown if retirement provision wasn't tax efficient, none of us would save for our retirement. That's the truth. And there's two approaches to this in the world. One, governments make pension contributions compulsory, so we don't have a choice. Or two, they encourage us to use pensions and to contribute and to save for our futures. And to do that, they incentivize us through taxation, because that obviously it makes us all richer at the end of the day with the less tax we pay. So they are, and as I said earlier, foreign pensions are understood in South Africa. We've got legislation in place that deals with them. So they're lawful, and there's a way for taxing them. And of course, that is in a tax efficient manner. So I think that sort of brings me to the end. Mark, your tree analogy, the sooner you start, the better it is for your retirement. My point there. But if you haven't started, there's no time like the present.
Brilliant. Thank you so
Back
much.
to you, Mark.
Really appreciate that insight. We're going to move on to the Q&A section now. So for those that don't have my details, here they are on screen now. I can see we've got some questions that have already come through in the chat box, so we'll do our best to answer those now and pick up on some of the threads that we've discussed today. I think the main thing really is that it's a really complex area working cross-border when it comes to taxation. You know, what should you be thinking about? What shouldn't you be thinking about? Our job as the financial planner is to really start to get through those issues and simplify those complex issues down to what you should be thinking about. The point about the tree analogy is it's best to just get on with it and do something for your financial future around the planning side of things. As Rex rightly pointed out, you know, without legislation in a lot of countries, people don't often save at all. You know, they spend money that they have, they pay taxes that they don't necessarily, you know, need to, or they pay a higher rate than they potentially need to, and they end up in a worse position overall in the longer term. And that's really where we come in. So I think we'll move on to the Q&A now. I'm going to start off with a question here. So yeah, if my UK partner has a temporary residence visa living in South Africa and is working as a freelance for UK companies, where does he pay tax? This is I don't want to do the standard "it depends" answer, which is what infuriates clients no end, you know, when we're trying to answer what is quite a complex subject. So I'll break it down as best I can. And one thing though, I do need to just refer you to attendee, because it's an anonymous question, is you know, the disclaimer at the beginning. You know, this isn't an individual consultation. You know, that's done offline. This isn't tax advice. You need to seek a professional tax consultant if that's what you want. But in general principles, what I can talk about is how most or how this would probably be interpreted in the very broad range. And one of the things that quite often is mistaken, as Rex talked at the beginning, you know, your citizenship, residency, and tax are not combined or don't converge easily. Okay, they're separate things. So by and large, the main thing that you need to be aware of is your physical presence in South Africa. If the individual is a UK individual, there are certain tests that need to be met that will then determine whether you're a South African tax resident or not. So in the first question, or first part of the question, you might actually still be a UK tax resident working abroad, and therefore, you know, you have to pay some form of taxation still to HMRC and live by their rules. After a period of time, if you tick certain boxes, then you would therefore be South Africa's responsibility going forward. And then obviously then that goes on to you know, the questions about, you know, working freelance, whether you do that through a company or whether you do that through an agency agreement. So sorry that it's not a very specific answer. I've done what I can with it for now, but those kind of questions really are best answered either directly in a discussion or with one of our tax consultant partners that we work with.
Mark, I can add a little bit more color to that if you'd like.
Different.
Yeah, so I think, you know, what Mark's saying there's, you know, absolutely right. And that first question that one has to ask is what I started with, is understanding where you're tax resident, because that'll answer your question, where do you have to pay your tax? So from a South African point of view, there's two ways you become tax resident. So if she's been living in South Africa, so this is her permanent, not how long she's been working here or working abroad, because I wasn't sure from that point whether she's working for the UK company outside of the borders of South Africa and just living here and commuting, or whether she's working in South Africa for that UK company and who's paying her. That all determines whether that else has a bearing on the taxing. But if she's been here for more than 91 days permanently in South Africa, then she, for over 6 tax years, then she's living in SA and virtually. Okay, so physical presence is the first test. Has she spent more than the 91 days in a tax year for the last over the last 6 tax years in South Africa? If she has, then she's tax resident in South Africa. Now, you might find she's also tax resident in the UK. However, the good news is South Africa and the UK has a double tax treaty arrangement, which sits on top of the tax laws in both countries. And then the tax treaty will be used to determine where you are resident. Okay, so then you forget all the rules we were just talking about. The treaty's got very specific provision that Mark was talking about, and the treaty will determine where you're resident. And once the treaty's determined your residency, which might be quite different from the tax rules I was speaking about, then you will pay tax in accordance with that treaty. So yeah, so countries where there's tax treaties, first of all, understand your residency or residency requirements for tax. And then, of course, go back to the treaty. But as Mark said, it is complex, and it's best to go and get tax advice on that.
Yeah, and what I'll add to that, Rex, it's a great question. We have this question, I'd say, at least once or twice a week from clients that we meet with. This is what I call the digital nomad question. It's really become more prevalent since COVID. Why? Because a lot of people that were living and working in the UK, as an example, back down in South Africa because they're South African, by birth. They're now still working for a UK employer, and kind of putting their head in the sand and thinking, well, I hope the whole thing goes away. Unfortunately, come back to one of the things I said earlier on, there's only really two things that are certainly life, death, and taxes. You can't pick a mix. The law is the law, and the key point really is find out what does apply to you in your circumstances around things like the physical presence test. If you're a South African national, are you actually ordinarily resident sooner than a Brit like me that came down and had to tick the boxes on those 3 physical presence tests? And then even if you do all of that, how are you billing? Are you writing out an invoice yourself and sending it up to be paid? Are you potentially doing it on payroll that, maybe you've got a payroll administrator still trying to pay you abroad? Or are you doing it through an agency arrangement with somebody like Mark is doing the invoices through an offshore arrangement? So there's a lot of little components there. So again, with that one, I really do think that it makes sense to sit down and explore that on a one-to-one basis.
Yeah, I see a bit extras being added on there by Anonymous. There's a nice easy test to do is wherever you are undertaking the effort, that is where tax will be paid. It's very simple, and yes, there are exceptions to that. But if the effort is being undertaken in South Africa, physically doing the work here in South Africa, even if you're not within the 91 days, that will typically be deemed to be a South African source because the effort is in South Africa, and therefore the tax on that effort should be paid in South Africa. So I expect that's what will happen is that you probably have a South African tax a South African tax liability on that source, or your partner will have a South African tax liability on the rewards for that effort that's undertaken in South Africa, and then that would trump the 91 days, the 91 days piece because it's South African sourced income. But as we've said, it's complex. It's complex.
Yeah, and again, I think we have to sort of draw a line on it there because this is sort of straight very much into specific advice on the individual. But the 91-day rule, so that's been asked about just now as well. So as a foreign national, there's 3 tests that really apply to somebody to deem whether they're South African tax resident. And one of them is, have they worked 91 days in the year of assessment? But then there's 2 others as well around the amount over the last 5 years and what have you. But I think we're going to have to just draw a line there and say, look, it does need, more of a specific discussion. But the thing is you're not alone. We've dealt with this conversation dozens and dozens of times. Mark, if I can just bring you in on this point here, there's something that you work with for people that, could be a digital nomad and then there's sort of the hybrid version, somebody that was in the UK, has come back to South Africa, they want to invoice their employer overseas, they might be working for more than one employer, they might be moving around different territories. How does something like an agency agreement simplify somebody's life when they're back in South Africa?
Sorry, Mark, my signal's really bad. I hope I got most of that. But essentially how it simplifies them, and Rex alluded to it a little bit earlier, is that we would really engage in what we would call the salary sacrifice portion of an agreement on the island. Okay, and as Rex alluded to, it's really important for that to be sound, solid, and vetted, which ours has been. So it's that decision about the correlation between the 1.25 that is tax-free, and should there be a balance or a sizable balance after that, getting away with leaving that on the island to then be reinvested at another stage, otherwise not bringing back on shore in terms of a salary sacrifice. So it's really client specific. I think your default area often sounds to clients like you skipping around, but you aren't. You really need to know their individual situation before you can advise them. As you know, when you've used us in the past, the client really fits into that bucket, and then you bring them to us. If they don't fit into the bucket, you look for alternatives.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing, is trying to, where does the financial planner sit in? So my job is to look at you as an individual, Mr. or Mrs. Client, and say, okay, with my knowledge and experience, having done this several hundred times before for other clients all over Africa, but South Africa specifically, could these solutions work for you at your net worth, with who you work for, where you're doing it, and the time that you'll spend out of the country? So there's a lot of components to it. One thing though, and this is the thing I want to sort of wrap up this point before we move on to the next question, is there is a tendency sometimes to kind of think you can game the system, around not paying tax and kind of, oh, they will never find me. And that's one thing we haven't really majored on that point, but I would really urge caution around this, particularly with the latest sort of technology that's available, and legislation, what's called the Common Reporting Standards. The main developed nations around the world are actively sharing information with each other. So if you're under the impression that you can kind of get away with not paying tax because you're working abroad and what have you, nobody really knows. What you could be doing is building up a massive problem that's best dealt with early, and I've had this discussion numerous times before, where we get brought in 5, 8, 10 years down the line after there's been a big penalty situation. So again, it makes sense to plant that tree early on, have a discussion, let us share the experience that we have over several hundred clients in these specific circumstances, and try and give you the best advice that works for you as an individual. Okay, I'm going to just take one more question. I'm conscious of time because we're already overrunning, and I know it's a very interesting subject. So thank you, Rex. Thank you, Mark, for all your input on all of this. I really appreciate it. One question though that's been asked: if I pass away before I have a chance to use my overseas pension, how will beneficiaries be taxed on the proceeds? And again, I hate doing the standard "it depends," because the little levers around all this are very nuanced. So if the beneficiaries are in South Africa, which quite often that they are, and if we, for example, leave funds in a certain way to, for example, a new pension structure, it does open up that some of these funds can move across to a new pension vehicle, and that would be a completely tax-free move in certain circumstances. There are lots of other different things that can be done there as well. But the key thing to think about really is that when it comes to protecting those assets overseas, as Rex was rightly saying earlier on, firstly, you're going to want them in the right currency. That last 4-year point on dollars versus rand shows why people want to save in primary currency, and they don't want to save in South African assets. Secondly, if we do that within a protected structure that has an element of tax efficiency about it, we're almost certainly going to put you into a better solution than if you just did it in your own capacity. But that's for us to try and put some data around to explain how that could all work. But nothing beats an actual story about reality. I've got, sadly, a number of situations where clients have passed away or are terminally ill, actually, with these kind of arrangements. And one story that I'll just leave you with as we close is around a client who passed away with several million euros of overseas personally owned assets and property and what have you, and a pension structure that we'd established that had a few €100,000 worth within it. The only money that flowed to his wife after he passed on unexpectedly was the amount that was available within the pension fund. 3 years later now, I think it is, the client's still arguing with the authorities in Germany, trying to get access to various different funds. And that's what Rex is talking about when he talks about cross-border probate and the time it takes. And the key point there is that by structuring some of those assets in a protected vehicle outside of South Africa, it steps outside the process in a very succinct, safe manner. Rex, I mean, this is your key area of specialism. So is there anything you want to add there that people should be thinking about around?
The only bit I'd add there, Mark, is that your international pensions provide significant flexibility in regards to the death benefits. So the first thing with a pension, when you pass away, all the unused assets are available for those people that you wanted to go to. So it's not like an annuity or a guaranteed pension where you die, half of the value goes to your spouse, maybe, or maybe it all gets lost. So first of all, your assets do get transferred. So that's a very important point. The question is, how do you transfer those assets? I think is what Mark said. It really does depend. But there are lots of different options. And I think the other thing is, we often see when people have passed away, they might have a spouse. They might have several kids. One's in Canada, one's in the UK, one's in South Africa. The wife might be in South Africa. So there's lots of different permutations. But the point is that the death benefit can be dealt with in such a way so that benefits can be paid to each one of those individuals in potentially different ways to ensure that it's as most an advantageous way for that person. That could be the assets settled into a trust and all the family being beneficiaries of the trust. It might just be the capital being distributed to a certain party and the income to another. It might be the pension effectively rolling over into another pension for the spouse. But there's an awful lot of choice, and that choice really is important. But again, that's where you go back to someone like Mark, who can sit down and truly understand what is your family situation and what do you want to achieve. So I think, but the point that I'm making is all the flexibility is there to meet whatever kind of scenario you're looking for. Genuinely, it is. It's just a case of putting the right wishes in place so that on death, as pension administrators, we can execute those wishes.
Excellent. All right, Rex, thank you very much for our sort of final word there. So again, just to wrap everything up, we are coming towards the end of the session. So please do reach out if you've got any questions at all, anything that you're not certain about that you want to clarify, reach out to the Holborn team and we'll do our very best to answer them. Rex, Mark, I just want to say both thank you very much for your time and support today. It's greatly appreciated.
Absolute pleasure.
Thanks, sir. And likewise, everybody, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I hope you have a great remainder of your day. Take care.